For thousands of years, people have moved across the more than 7,000 islands that make up the Philippine archipelago, settling, mixing, trading, and building one of the most linguistically and genetically diverse nations on Earth. And for just as long, nobody actually knew what that constant movement had left behind in the DNA of the people living there today. Scientists finally set out to find out, sampling and sequencing DNA from dozens of ethno-linguistic groups spread across islands separated by hundreds of miles of open ocean. If genetics, deep history, and the real evidence-based story of human migration interest you, stay for this one and hit subscribe. Because we dig into stories exactly like this every week. Here's what makes the Philippines such a genuinely difficult puzzle for population geneticists in the first place. Add to that the sheer geography involved. The Philippine archipelago spans over 7,000 islands, stretching more than 1,000 miles from north to south, with over 100 distinct ethno-linguistic groups recognized across the country, each speaking their own language or dialect, many with histories of relative isolation from their neighbors, simply because of the physical difficulty of travel between islands before modern transportation existed. That kind of geography is exactly the sort of environment that preserves genetic diversity rather than erasing it. Small, semi-isolated populations tend to retain distinctive ancestral signatures for far longer than large, highly interconnected mainland populations do, which is part of why the Philippines has become such a valuable natural laboratory for researchers trying to reconstruct the deep history of human movement through island Southeast Asia and into the wider Pacific. It's worth pausing on just how unusual that level of linguistic diversity really is. What genetic sequencing has now done is turn that indirect linguistic clue into direct, measurable biological evidence, confirming that the Philippines' famous diversity of languages sits on top of an equally deep and equally real diversity in ancestry. To untangle all of that, researchers didn't just take a handful of samples from Manila and call it representative of the whole country. One of the most comprehensive of these efforts, led by researchers including Maximilian Larina working alongside population geneticists at Uppsala University in Sweden, sequenced and analyzed genome-wide data from well over 100 ethno-linguistic groups across the archipelago, one of the largest and most detailed genetic surveys ever conducted of a single nation's indigenous diversity, and the dataset that ultimately produced the discovery this video is built around. The deepest layer this research uncovered belongs to a group of communities collectively known as Negrito populations, including groups like the Ayta, the Agta, and the Ayta, spread across scattered mountain and forest communities primarily on the island of Luzon, along with related groups on several other islands. Genetically, Negrito populations carry ancestry that traces back to some of the very earliest modern humans to reach island Southeast Asia, tens of thousands of years ago, during a period when much lower sea levels connected many of the islands into a single larger landmass researchers call Sundaland, and when crossing to the remaining more isolated islands, including parts of the Philippines, still required deliberate sea voyages using some of the earliest known maritime technology in human history. These earliest populations carry a genetic signature most closely related to other so-called Negrito and Melanesian populations, scattered elsewhere across the region, in the Andaman Islands, in the Bay of Bengal, in parts of Malaysia, and further east into Papua New Guinea and Australia. A widely separated string of communities whose shared deep ancestry is one of the clearest genetic fingerprints left behind by that very first wave of modern humans moving out of Africa and along the southern coast of Asia tens of thousands of years before agriculture, before pottery, before almost anything in the conventional historical record. What's striking is how these communities have survived as genetically distinct populations for so long, even while living in close geographic proximity to much larger neighboring groups for thousands of years. Cultural practices, including patterns of marrying within the community and, in many cases, a semi-nomadic or forest-based lifestyle quite different from the settled agricultural communities that arrived later, appear to have helped preserve these deep ancestral signatures relatively undiluted, even as later migrations swept through the same islands and, in many places, settled in large numbers nearby. That relative isolation is precisely what makes these communities so scientifically valuable today. They function almost like a living archive of the earliest chapter of the archipelago's human history, still readable in their genomes tens of thousands of years later. For a long time, that early layer was assumed to be a relatively simple, singular founding population for the archipelago. Later research has revealed something far more complicated, evidence that these early Negrito populations weren't one single migration wave, but likely reflect at least 2 or 3 separate early arrivals, arriving at different points over an extended period, each contributing a genetically distinct component that still shows up when comparing different Negrito communities against each other today. Even within this oldest layer of Philippine ancestry, there was already more diversity than a single first settlers narrative could capture. The next major layer arrived far more recently, and it's one of the best documented migrations in Pacific prehistory. The archaeological evidence for this expansion is genuinely remarkable to trace. These early Austronesian communities brought with them a distinctive package of technology and practices. Rice and other domesticated crops, polished stone tools, and crucially, sophisticated outrigger canoe technology that allowed relatively small groups of settlers to deliberately cross open ocean and colonize island after island in sequence, moving south through the Philippines, then onward through Indonesia, and eventually out across the vast, previously uninhabited stretches of the Pacific. Linguists have been able to reconstruct much of this journey independently, simply by comparing related Austronesian languages spoken today from Taiwan all the way to Hawaii and New Zealand, and the genetic data lines up remarkably closely with what the linguistic family tree had already suggested. Instead, genetic data shows a pattern of admixture. Incoming Austronesian farmers mixing with existing local populations to varying degrees depending on the region, producing the majority lowland Filipino genetic profile recognized today, a profile that carries substantial East Asian-related ancestry from that Taiwanese origin expansion, layered on top of and mixed with the much older ancestry already present on the islands. The proportion of that mixture varies significantly by region and by community, which is part of why genetic diversity across the Philippines remains so high even today. The archipelago wasn't simply repopulated by the newer arrivals. It was blended unevenly, island by island, over thousands of years. On top of those two deep layers sit several more recent, historically documented waves of contact, each leaving its own smaller but measured. Extensive trade contact with South Asia, running for centuries before European contact, left detectable South Asian genetic influence in parts of the archipelago, alongside the loanwords from Sanskrit that still survive in several Philippine languages today, along with cultural and religious influence visible in early Philippine writing systems and political structures that predate any European presence in the region entirely. Centuries of trade and, in some regions, settlement from China left a measurable East Asian genetic contribution distinct from the earlier Austronesian layer, concentrated particularly in certain lowland and coastal communities with long-documented histories of Chinese trade and intermarriage, some going back well over 1,000 years before Spanish contact, predating the colonial period by a wide margin, and more than 3 centuries of Spanish colonial rule, beginning in the 16th century, followed by a shorter period of American administration in the 20th century, left a real, if generally smaller, European genetic component in much of the modern population, alongside the Spanish-influenced culture, religion, and surnames that remain far more visible today than the genetic contribution itself. It's a genuinely interesting mismatch worth pointing out. An enormous share of the population carries Spanish-derived surnames today, a legacy of a 19th century colonial decree that assigned standardized Spanish surnames to Filipino families for administrative purposes, yet the actual genetic contribution from Spanish colonizers, measured directly through DNA, is considerably smaller than the surname pattern alone would suggest. Surnames and genetics, in this specific case, tell 2 genuinely different stories about the same colonial history. Layer all of that together, island by island, and you get a picture of the Philippines as one of the most genetically layered nations anywhere on Earth. Not a single population, but a mosaic assembled from at least 6 or 7 distinct historical episodes of migration and contact, each one leaving a measurable trace that researchers can still isolate and date using modern genomic tools. And that brings us to the result that actually shocked the scientists studying this data. When researchers looked closely at one particular Negrito community, a group called the Ayta Magbukon, living in the mountains of Bataan province on the island of Luzon, a community numbering only a few thousand people, they found something nobody expected to see anywhere in the world at that level. Buried in their genome was an unusually large proportion of ancestry from Denisovans, an extinct group of archaic humans, cousins of the Neanderthals, known mostly from a small number of fossil fragments recovered from a single cave in Siberia and a few sites in Asia, whose existence was only confirmed through DNA analysis in the first place, since so little physical fossil evidence of them has ever been found. To this day, the entire physical fossil record of Denisovans consists of little more than a finger bone, a few teeth, and a handful of other bone fragments. An almost unbelievably thin physical record for a population that clearly once ranged across a wide swath of Asia and interbred with modern humans on more than one occasion. It helps to understand a little about who the Denisovans actually were before diving deeper into what this finding means. Denisovans were closely related to Neanderthals, both descending from a common ancestor that had already split from the lineage leading to modern humans hundreds of thousands of years earlier. But Denisovans appear to have ranged across a different geographic area, spreading through parts of Asia, while Neanderthals occupied much of Europe and the Near East, with the 2 populations occasionally overlapping and even interbreeding with each other in addition to separately interbreeding with modern humans. Most people outside Africa carry some Neanderthal ancestry today, typically around 1 to 2% of their genome, a legacy of interbreeding that happened as early modern humans expanded out of Africa and into Neanderthal territory in the Near East and Europe. Denisovan ancestry had already been known to survive in modern populations, particularly in Papua New Guinea and parts of Melanesia, where indigenous populations carry some of the highest previously documented levels anywhere on Earth, typically estimated at around 4 to 6% of their overall genome. A legacy of ancient interbreeding between Denisovans and the modern human populations that first moved through Asia into the Pacific region tens of thousands of years ago. That Papuan figure had stood as the benchmark, the highest confirmed level of Denisovan ancestry in any living population for years, cited repeatedly across the scientific literature as essentially the ceiling for how much of this particular archaic ancestry could plausibly survive in a modern genome. What researchers didn't expect was to find a Philippine population carrying an even higher level of Denisovan ancestry than those previously identified record holders in Papua New Guinea. But that's exactly what the data showed. The Ayta Magbukon community turned out to carry the highest documented level of Denisovan ancestry of any population studied anywhere in the world, even edging out the Papuan populations that had held that distinction for years. It was a genuinely unexpected result, published in a peer-reviewed genetics journal, that immediately raised a new question nobody had a ready answer for. How did a small, specific community in the mountains of Luzon end up carrying more of this specific archaic ancestry than any other population scientists had ever measured, anywhere on the planet? The leading explanation researchers have proposed is that this Philippine result doesn't simply reflect the same single ancient interbreeding event already known to have contributed Denisovan ancestry to Papuan and other Pacific populations. Instead, the statistical pattern in the data, specifically the way this extra Denisovan ancestry layered on top of, rather than simply overlapping with, the Denisovan signal already known from other regional populations, is consistent with a separate, distinct pulse of Denisovan ancestry, entering the ancestors of this specific Negrito population through an encounter that happened independently, somewhere along their own specific migration route through island Southeast Asia. Denisovans, a population known to science almost entirely through a handful of bone and tooth fragments and the DNA extracted from them, were apparently living and interbreeding with modern humans across a wider stretch of island Southeast Asia, and on more than one separate occasion than the existing fossil record had ever suggested was possible. The Ayta Magbukon result didn't just set a new record for Denisovan ancestry. Denisovans left almost no recognizable skeletal trace across island Southeast Asia. No cave site in the Philippines has ever produced a confirmed Denisovan fossil, and the region as a whole has produced remarkably little direct archaic human fossil evidence of any kind compared to sites in Europe or mainland Asia. The only reason scientists know Denisovans were ever connected to this specific region at all is that their DNA survived, diluted but still measurably present, inside a living population thousands of generations later. The fossil record went cold. The genome didn't. There's also a practical detail behind how researchers even managed to isolate an ancient archaic signal like this one inside a modern genome, and it's worth understanding, because it's what makes the finding credible rather than speculative. It's the same fundamental logic used to detect recent versus distant human relatives on a consumer ancestry test, just applied here to a relationship spanning tens of thousands of years and a different branch of the human family tree entirely. It's worth being precise about what this discovery does and doesn't tell us. An elevated proportion of Denisovan ancestry in one specific community doesn't mean the Ayta Magbukon are somehow more primitive or less modern than any other human population alive today. Every detail of that framing would be a serious misunderstanding of what ancient admixture actually represents. All modern humans outside of Africa carry some archaic ancestry, whether Neanderthal, Denisovan, or both, inherited from ordinary interbreeding events that happened as early modern human populations expanded across Eurasia and into the Pacific tens of thousands of years ago. The Ayta Magbukon simply carry a larger proportion of one specific archaic component than any other population measured so far. A difference in degree, reflecting a distinct piece of their specific migration history, not a difference in what kind of humans they are today. It's also worth noting that this finding continues to be refined as more populations across the region get sampled. Researchers studying Philippine genetic diversity have specifically called for more comprehensive sampling of additional Negrito communities and other understudied groups across the archipelago's thousands of islands, since a discovery this significant, found in one relatively small, previously undersampled community, strongly suggests there's more of this deep, archaic history still waiting to be found in other communities that simply haven't been sequenced yet. Several related Negrito communities elsewhere in the Philippines have shown elevated, though somewhat lower, Denisovan ancestry as well, suggesting the Ayta Magbukon result may be the clearest example of a broader pattern across multiple related communities, rather than a completely isolated anomaly confined to one single group. The same relative isolation that allowed these Negrito communities to preserve such a distinctive deep ancestral signature from the earliest wave of modern human settlement in the region is very likely the same factor that allowed this unusually high Denisovan signal to survive largely undiluted as well, generation after generation. While it was gradually diluted down to far lower levels in most other populations across Asia and the Pacific through thousands of years of subsequent mixing with newly arriving groups. The isolation that makes these communities such a valuable genetic archive for one chapter of human history turns out to be exactly what preserved this second, entirely unexpected chapter as well. There's a practical layer to this story too, worth mentioning for anyone in the audience who has Filipino ancestry and has taken a consumer DNA test themselves. Standard consumer ancestry tests are not designed to detect or report archaic ancestry like this at all. They're built to compare your DNA against modern reference populations, not against a Siberian archaic human genome. So a Denisovan signal like the one found in the Ayta Magbukon would never show up on an ordinary Ancestry DNA or 23andMe report, no matter how much of it someone happened to carry. Finding it requires the kind of specialized academic sequencing and archaic genome comparison used in the research behind this video, which is part of why a discovery this significant could sit undetected for so long, hiding in plain sight inside a community's DNA until a dedicated research team finally went looking with the right tools. That's also worth remembering as a broader lesson about ancestry testing generally. The percentages and regions on a consumer report are a genuinely useful window into your recent documented family history. But they are not, and were never designed to be, a complete accounting of everything meaningful sitting inside your genome. Deeper, older, rarer signals like archaic ancestry live at a level most consumer tools simply aren't built to look for, which means there is very likely more genuine history sitting inside all of our DNA from every population than any of us currently has the tools to fully read. Put the whole picture together, and the Philippines turns out to be far more than a single uniform Filipino DNA story. It's a genuine record of tens of thousands of years of layered migration, an ancient Negrito founding population itself made up of more than one early wave, a massive Austronesian farming expansion that would eventually help populate half the Pacific Ocean, centuries of trade contact with South Asia and China, and 300 years of Spanish and American colonial contact, all stacked on top of each other, unevenly, island by island, with one small mountain community in Luzon quietly holding on to a genetic connection to an extinct human relative more strongly than any other population scientists have found anywhere else on Earth. That's the real story sitting underneath a country that most outside observers, and honestly plenty of Filipinos themselves, have only ever thought of as a single national identity. The genetics tell a far richer, far more layered story, one written across tens of thousands of years, 7,000 islands, and at least one encounter with an extinct branch of the human family tree that left its clearest surviving trace not in a museum display case, but in the living genome of a community still calling those Luzon mountains home today. It's also a reminder of something worth sitting with more broadly. The Ayta Magbukon are not a large or widely known population. Outside of specialist genetic circles, most people, including most Filipinos, had likely never heard of this specific community before this discovery made headlines. And yet, this one small group, numbering only a few thousand people, turned out to be sitting on a piece of deep human history more significant than what's been found in populations numbering in the millions. That's a pattern worth remembering the next time a small or isolated community gets mentioned in passing in a documentary or a history class. Genetic isolation, the very thing that can make a community seem peripheral to the mainstream historical narrative, is often exactly what preserves the deepest and rarest pieces of the human story, waiting quietly for the right sequencing technology to finally come along and read it. It also reframes what a phrase like 3,000 islands really means once you follow the genetics all the way down. It isn't just a description of geography. It's a description of thousands of separate semi-isolated genetic experiments, each one shaped by exactly which populations happened to arrive on that particular island, in exactly what order and how much contact followed afterward. And the Ayta Magbukon result is a reminder that at least one of those experiments preserved something no other population studied anywhere on Earth has been found to preserve at the same level. Multiply that by every other undersampled community scattered across the archipelago's smaller, harder-to-reach islands, and it becomes clear this discovery is very unlikely to be the last surprise the Philippines' deep genetic history still has waiting to be found.